Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. Like Natalia was saying earlier, really excited to have you here for a Leading Change webinar. So my name is Amanda Schaefer. I'm introducing Natalia here this morning. So just a few things for just quick logistics from a chat standpoint. The chat will be turned off soon. There's going to be a poll question that Natalia is asking just so there's additional participation. So just keep an eye on that. But the chat will eventually be turned off. And then we will make sure that you guys delegate your questions to Natalia directly. So just ensure that you do that throughout the webinar. So those direct questions will be sent to her. And if you have any technical issues during this time of the webinar, please feel free to send those to Shige. So send a direct message to Shige if you need assistance in any technical issues. Outside of that, let's get started here. So welcome. Today we are pleased to welcome Natalia Ba, a longtime instructor with Graduate School USA, where she has been teaching for more than 15 years. Natalia delivers training across leadership and management, project management, and human resources, and has played a key role in developing curriculum for the school, including change management workshops and project management courses. She has served as an learning coach, instructor, and facilitator for federal leadership programs within the Center of Leadership Management and regularly leads self-assessments and dynamic team building sessions for government professionals. Outside of graduate school, Natalia is a business owner providing executive coaching, training, and consulting services to both public and private sector organizations. She is the creator of the Define and Achieve Your Goals process and is a certified Berkman Method consultant. Natalia holds a Master of Science in Project Management with the George Washington University School of Business, where she also served as a teaching assistant and received the Project Management Award and has served as a project management professional. We're really excited to have Natalia with us today and look forward to her insights. So take it away, Natalia.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to be with everyone. Thank you for calling in from all over the country and for telling me where you are from. Also, thank you for putting in some of your examples for change that you have experienced. I have return to work, reorganization, new manager, leader, losing team members, software migration, policy changes, AI, and decision making. And those are all great examples. So, our topic for today is leading change, practical change management skills for federal leaders. And whenever I do a webinar or teach a class, I want to give you information that you can immediately reflect on and hopefully utilize. So, at the end of the session, Amanda is going to post in the chat a reflection page that's going to summarize everything I talked about and give you some reflection questions that you can work on afterwards. I am hoping that everyone will be able to sort of take what we've talked about today and really be able to think about how can you utilize this information in current or upcoming change situations. So here's what we're going to cover today. I want to start with a discussion about change versus transition, because I think a lot of times we focus so much on change, but we don't focus enough on the transition and what that actually means. We're also going to talk about some of the common reactions that we see when people are faced with a change event. We're going to cover the ADKAR framework. So if you noticed, Amanda said that my academic background and my geeky passion is in project management. So I like having like process and framework to work with. And I find that even in change, that's possible. And so I want to give sort of a very high level overview of the ADKAR framework. We're also going to talk about some of the leadership strengths that can be used for change, as well as some of the types of resistance that we see for change. So, whether you're a formal or informal leader right now, or an employee, whatever your position is, change is probably touching you now at this point in your career, or very soon will be. And so, I hope that you guys will find this interesting and helpful in that. whether you're leading the change or you're just impacted by the change. So, as I said, the first thing I want to talk about is change versus transition. And so, I want to start off with sort of explaining what is the difference between those two things. So, change is the events and initiatives, and organizations often decide that they need a change event because that's how an organization evolves, right? So, if your mission has changed or if you have a new strategic priority, something like that happens, there's often going to be an event or initiative that is going to cause change. And it's often driven by leaders, but change is really focused on what's going to be different. And the way we get change actually to occur is through all my project management stuff, right? Plans and timelines and schedules and budgets and all of that. But the other thing that occurs is transition. And transition is more of a psychological process. This is what the people impacted by the change experience. So, how do people feel about the change? And that can be measured by how well they understand the change, how well they accept the change, and how engaged they are in the change process. So, I want to give you an example of a change and an example of the transition. So I know somebody said that a software migration was an example of a change. So a change is that there's a new system that's going to go live on October 1st. That is the change. And oftentimes leaders are so focused on what do I have to do to get that system ready and live by October 1st that they don't necessarily stop and think about, okay, what's going to happen from a transition standpoint? So the transition to a new system is likely going to lead to staff feeling uncertain about things like, am I going to be able to learn this new system? Am I going to be able to learn this new system quickly? Am I going to like it as much as the last system? Is this new system going to in any way impact my job? They can be very worried about making mistakes. And they also can question why the decision was made to implement a new system in the first place. So the change is one thing, that's the event that is actually going to happen, but the transition is what the people or the employees are going to experience. And we need, as leaders, to really be thinking and focusing on both. When a leader focuses only on the change, there are things that can occur when they're not focusing at all on the impact on the individual or their concerns or whatever. Resistance to the change can occur. There can be frustration and confusion. And most importantly, potentially for the success of your change event, is that adoption can slow. So you can have a process to put a new system in, but if people aren't using that system, it's not going to be a successful change event. So, what does that mean? That means that leaders need to also address transition. And when that is done, by the leader as they are going through the change event, it allows trust to increase. It also gets the people, the employees, more engaged in the change event. And most importantly, the change is more likely to stick. So people are more likely to use that new system. So when I talk about change, I think it's very natural for a leader, especially one like me that has the project management background, right? You tell me you need a change, and I'm starting to think about the schedule and the timeline and the activities. But what we know is that you also need to address the transition. You have to address how it's actually going to impact the employees. So, when we're thinking about the transition, what can be helpful is for us to be aware of some of the common reactions that people can have to change. And as I said, often a leader experiences the change cognitively first. Like my example, I am told that there needs to be a change, and I begin to think about, all right, what do I need to do? What kind of resources do I need? What is the timeline? How much budget do I have? But what we find is that teams and employees often experience change emotionally first. So at the beginning, when people were coming in, I said, hey, put in the chat, what is a change you've experienced in the past? And a lot of people put in reorganization as an example of change that they've experienced in the past. When I first became a government contractor, I was working in a government agency, and the area that I was working, they announced a reorganization. And I think it's the first time that I sort of understood the concept of people digging their heels in. I mean, people were just like, absolutely not. We do not want to go through a reorg. And it was a very emotional reaction, visceral, to be honest with you. And part of it, I realize, is I think it's natural for emotions to come up when change happens, right? And especially for employees who may not have any kind of control or input in that change. But the other thing that I realized was it was the fact that reorgs had been mishandled or unpleasant in the past that also increased their resistance to that change event. So we just need to remember that emotions can drive behavior during change, even from the very beginning when a change event is announced. And so what we want to realize as leaders is that if we ignore emotions, it doesn't make them go away. It's really, unfortunately, potentially can amplify. And so we want to be sure that we're considering that as a leader. So this is the change curve. And I'm going to walk us through the change curve. It's kind of like what people experience as they're going through a change. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to ask Shige to put up a poll question because I want you guys to be thinking about which reaction on the change curve have you personally experienced? And I believe it's just you can only answer one. So I'm interested to see what you guys come up with. The first example is shock. I did not see this coming can be the reaction that we get from someone. Remember I told you about the people digging their heels in the ground when the reorganization was announced. Just shock. That can be the very first reaction that someone can have when they are faced with a change event. The second is denial. Oh, this really won't affect us. The other one that I hear a lot is this really isn't going to happen. I mean, it is truly denying that the change is actually real. So that's another reaction that we can see. The third reaction is resistance. And resistance is this doesn't make sense, aka I'm not going to participate. So that resistance is a real issue. And people ask me, like, why are you so interested in change management? Well, I'm a project manager by training, and most projects result in some kind of change. And so, as a project manager by training, I have to understand change resistance because my project is not likely to be successful if I can't get people to accept it. This resistance is what can really negatively impact an organization, and it can actually stop the ability for the change to occur. And remember, leaders aren't coming up with change just for fun, right? They're coming up with change because we need that change to be able to grow and improve our organization. Now, once we get sort of to the bottom of the curve here, we can go into exploration. And exploration is that realization of, well, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe I can make this work. Maybe this is going to make my job actually easier. And finally, acceptance. This is the new way. So when we go back to the example that we had earlier about the new system is going into effect on October 1st, we want to go from shock to acceptance as painlessly and as quickly as we can because we want people to be utilizing that new system, not fighting against it, for instance. All right, so I'm going to, in this poll, thank you very much. I'm going to share the results. We have 27% said they had experienced shock, 8% denial, 31% resistance, 18% exploration, and 16% acceptance. So I really appreciate you guys sharing that insight into the reactions that you personally have experienced. And the top two are resistance and shock. Very natural to have these kinds of reactions when a change is introduced. So, as I said, because of my project management background, I like to have a process. I like to have a framework to work within. And so, I want to talk about the ADKAR framework. And this is a framework that really helps us understand how people experience change and the process they go through to adapt to that change. The idea of the ADKAR framework is, in my mind, I like to think of it and use it sort of as like a checklist, right? It allows me to think about, well, let me go through each step of this framework and identify where people might be stuck and figure out what the solution possibly could be for me as a leader that I can use. And so for um, successful change, what probably is going to happen is that people are going to move through all the aspects of the ADKAR framework. So let's dive in and talk about what each of those are. So ADKAR, each letter stands for a word, and the first word A is awareness. That is the first part of the framework. And that is when people can answer the question of why is this change happening? Remember a minute ago, I said that part of the emotional reaction people can have to a change is not understanding the change, often because they don't have any control over it, right? Suddenly the shock occurs because they didn't even know that change was in the planning or was even a possibility. So the first aspect of the framework is awareness, being able to have your employees understand why the change is happening. And the leader plays a key role in this. The leader needs to be able to explain why the change is occurring. And there's a key word here, repeatedly. Repeatedly. And the reason it's repeatedly is, especially when we're dealing with emotions, people may not hear you the first or the second or the third time. You have to just keep repeating and be consistent in your messaging of why the change is happening. The leader also needs to be addressing rumors and misinformation that can be occurring. And so that, of course, when we think about just generally the role of the leader, there's a lot of communication that has to occur to make sure that employees in a change environment understand and are aware of why the change is happening. So, what this tells us is that if we determine that people on our team are stuck at awareness, we might want to stop and say, this could be a communication problem. Could I be doing a better job of communicating? Could I be communicating more often and more consistently about why the change is happening? So that's the first part of the framework, awareness. D stands for desire, and desire is the concept of someone understanding why they should support the change. And I'll tell you from a project management standpoint, what I have seen is we've gone into organizations and for instance, we're changing a software and we are all excited about this software because we know that this software is going to change this person's job. It's going to make their job easier. It's going to be easier to report, easier to see data, whatever it is. But what sometimes we fail to do is to explain that to the person. And so we go in assuming they're going to love this new software, right? They're going to love this new way of doing their job. But the person on the other end isn't looking at that in that way. They don't have any desire. Why would they change something that in their mind is already working? So, as a leader for this aspect of the framework, we've got to make sure that people understand why they should support the change. And the leader's job is listening to concerns. So, active listening is very important in understanding what are you hearing from your employees about their reaction to the change? Are they concerned about learning a new system, having time to take the training? Their job being eliminated, right? These are all things that we have to understand. And I will just say, as an aside, we're coming into the world of AI, right? And artificial intelligence is something that I feel like the train has left the station and we just all are going to eventually have to get on that train. And this is one where we need to be listening to the concerns of our employees. And we also need to be acknowledging loss and discomfort. That's a huge change that's going to happen. And we need to show that empathy as leaders and really understand, how do people feel about this change? What are they worried about? What is their discomfort? And acknowledge that those feelings exist. Now, if we find that the people on our team are stuck and they're not reaching the support of the change that we expect, then we need to be thinking as leaders, okay, is this a trust issue? Is this a loss issue, right? Do I have a good trust relationship with my employees? Do they trust what I'm telling them or how I'm influencing them to support this change? Or are they really focused on the loss aspect of losing the way they did the work before? A lot of times, guys, we've created the processes in which we do our work, and we may actually feel ownership of those processes. And when it's time for those processes to change, it really can feel like a major loss. So if you find that your people are stuck at this aspect of the framework, we want to consider, is it a trust or a loss issue? The next aspect, the K, is knowledge. And knowledge is the employee's understanding, how do I go about changing? So this is something that, again, can be very hard. You can tell someone we're going to give you a new system, but that person may be thinking, well, that's great. The new system is going to be there by October 1st, but how am I going to know how to use that new system? Are you going to just show me one time and I'm expected to understand it? So we have to know as a leader that we have to ensure that the training and the guidance are available. And I think that's very important and something sometimes we forget about. And it goes back to the transition, understanding it's not just a change, but it's a transition, to making sure that the employees understand what we're going to do to help them successfully change. And another aspect of this from the leader's perspective is to clarify what success looks like. And success does not necessarily look like that within one day you know how to use the new system. Success is not going to look like zero mistakes the first month you use a new system. So these are things that are very important for the leader to establish. Now, if people are stuck at the knowledge aspect of the framework, then what do we know? We know that it could be a training problem. And so you want to think about, are we giving them the training and the guidance that they really need to be able to either make the change or to feel like that they will be able to make the change? The A is ability, and ability is the next step, right? For the employee, can I actually do this? And as a leader, the way people are going to be able to use a new system or do something differently is to have opportunities to practice. And so we want to create that environment where people can practice, right? And they can maybe make a mistake, learn from it, try again. And we certainly want to be encouraging them and giving them feedback on how they're doing. And unfortunately, sometimes people do get stuck at ability, and maybe it is a practice or support problem. Maybe they don't have enough time to practice. Maybe there's too much pressure. Maybe they need more support. I went into an organization and we changed their project management software. And we had people, even after all the training, that got stuck at ability. And one of the things we instituted was desk side assistance. So I would actually sit down with a project manager and help them one. Sorry, guys, I think I got muted there real quick. I would actually sit down with people one on one and help them and give them one on one assistance with that software because there was some support that was missing and we were able to fill that in. And then the final R in ADKAR is reinforcement. And so the question is, when we have a change, is it actually going to stick? Are people going to maintain using it? So, what is the leader's role? The leader's role is to reinforce what they want the people to do. I want you to be using the new software. I want you to be using the new process that we've created. And one way that leaders can do this is to model commitment to the change. So, although I feel like Amanda made me sound really old with her introduction, and I will give her a hard time about that later. Um, I was not around when the internet became a thing within the working world. I mean, I was obviously alive, but I was not in the workforce. I was probably in college when that happened. I know I'm ancient, but anyway, the point is that I remember hearing stories about CEOs and executives who had computers in their office and they never turned them on. They refused to use the internet, they emailed, they refused to do that. And that to me is an example of a leader not modeling commitment to the change. And I think back to that time and I don't know if I can find studies or something because I think we might have the same issue that's going to potentially occur with AI. We may have leaders who are telling, we know we have to use AI at some point, but are they going to model their commitment to the change as well? And if you find that people are stuck at reinforcement, if they keep going back to the old system or the old way of doing something, it could be a leadership consistency problem. And so you want to look at yourself and make sure that you are modeling the commitment you expect from others. All right, so that was the ADKAR framework, and I love that because I feel like that it gives you a way to sort of gauge how the people on your team are handling a change. But one of the ways that leaders can help other people through change is through using some of their leadership strengths. And so I've chosen four leadership strengths that I'm going to talk about: decisiveness, collaboration, detail oriented, and vision focused. All great leadership strengths, important to have, but also important to use during a change experience. So, what does this mean? Well, first of all, decisiveness means that as a leader, you are being decisive in making decisions. So that means that there's going to be momentum. Things are going to progress. It also provides clear direction for people. So they are hopefully less anxious because they have somebody being decisive. And it signals confidence even in that change, right? Because as a leader, I am being decisive as this change is occurring. However, it can potentially be overused during change. And decisiveness, when used too much during a change experience, can feel very dismissive because you may feel like that leader is making lots of decisions, but not considering the employee's position or feedback or emotions on the change that's occurring. So that's the first strength, which is decisiveness. And we're going to have a poll in a second. And I want you guys to think about which of these strengths would you most need to be utilizing or flexing in a change experience in your organization. The second strength is the ability to collaborate. And so during a change event, this is really important because it can help build trust and buy-in to support the actual change. And when collaborating with others, you might realize that people have a perspective on something that you didn't see, which could surface risk, for instance, or ideas that could improve the way the change is being done. And generally, good collaboration is going to increase commitment to the outcomes. And that's what we want ultimately, is to increase the likelihood that people are going to accept the change and begin to use it. But even a collaboration can be overused, right? And if you are collaborating too much, and that's not something I usually would say, it can slow decisions. So, as with any strength, we have to balance how much we're using it. Another strength is detail oriented, and we can use this during a change event because the more detail oriented we are, the less hopefully confusion and errors that will occur, right? So it provides a level of stability, it provides a level of certainty, and it also can help when translating, we have this strategy for this change to occur, but here in detail are the actionable steps that you need to do, and when I expect you to do it, and how I expect you to do it. Unfortunately, sometimes being detail oriented can overwhelm people, though, right? Because I think Amanda mentioned I use a self-assessment called the Berkman, and so I love talking to people about the different personality types and how you have to adjust. Not everyone's personality likes detail oriented. That can sometimes overwhelm, and so leaders need to be aware of that. And finally, the strength that we can use is being vision focused. And how we use that during change means that we're giving a lot of meaning and direction so people understand where we're going and why we're doing it. It can really help teams stay motivated. And it can also connect, you're doing this today, this is happening today, so that this will happen in the future. So it can really connect the change that's occurring today to what we expect the future to look like. But even that can be overused, right? It can feel disconnected if you're focusing so much on the future and not so much on the day to day. So thank you, Shige, for opening the poll. I see lots of people answering. The question is, which leadership strength do you think would be the most beneficial for you to use during a change event in your organization? And I'm going to give people a few minutes to answer that. All right. So far, the leading contender so far is definitely collaboration. We've got a few more seconds and then it's going to close. And we will see what it looks like at the end. Thank you. We've got 70% participation. Thank you for that. Okay. So we have 48% of the people said that collaboration was the strength that would be most beneficial to use during change. 25% said vision focused. 16% said decisiveness, and 11% said detail oriented. So that's excellent. Thank you for participating in that poll. And that's something for you guys to sort of think about and note as you're thinking, because you all work in obviously in different environments with different cultures. And it's important to know which of these strengths might be the most beneficial for you to use. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about, and then I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions. And as I mentioned in the beginning, and I know we've had some people coming in, I have a reflection sheet that I'm going to have Amanda put in the chat at the end of the session. And that's going to review everything that we talked or that I talked about today, as well as giving you a reflection question. So you can actually think about it in the context of your own situation at work. So let's talk about some of the major types of resistance to change that we see. And I want to start out with just reminding you that resistance to change is a natural response, right? I mean, human beings generally want certainty and predictability. That's just a normal human being kind of thing. And so it is natural that when we are faced with uncertainty or loss, that resistance may occur. And I think it's important to remember this because resistance can feel very intentional and it can feel a little malicious. But most resistance to change in the workplace is neither of those things. What the key differentiator is, in my opinion, is how the leader responds to resistance, because how they respond is going to determine whether that resistance sort of builds and grows and becomes stronger, or if it softens and people are less resistant to the change. So, we're going to go through some of the types of resistance that we see. The first one is emotional resistance, and I've already talked about all the way from the beginning of the webinar when we talked about transition that there can be emotional responses to change. And emotional resistance can look like anxiety, frustration, disengagement. So something as basic as someone not commenting in a meeting when you're discussing a change, or looking bored or disconnected. I mean, that is a hint for you as a leader that someone potentially could be expressing emotional resistance. Even just frustration, you can see it in their body language, or you can hear it in the things that they're saying. That training's going to be too long. I don't have time to do that training, whatever. Those are examples of being able to recognize that what somebody might be experiencing is emotional resistance. And sometimes the reason that emotional resistance can occur goes back to, what causes a lot of this, which is sort of processing loss. You can be feeling like you're losing status, for instance. If you are, the number one person at using this software and you have been for years and everybody comes to you for advice and all of that, that status that you have as an expert is going to be lost when the software changes. And that feels like a loss to us when that occurs. We also can be processing the loss of a routine or a loss of expertise that we have. So, emotional resistance, as I said, is very normal. It can occur. We need to be aware of that as a type of resistance. Another type of resistance is cognitive resistance. So that can look like people challenging assumptions or rationale. Like, why are we having this change? This doesn't make sense that we would change that process after so long. It doesn't make sense that we would reorganize after we reorganized last year, for instance. But what is happening when we see cognitive resistance is that people are trying to really understand the why. And they may be trying to regain some of the predictability that is often lost when a change is announced. We also can have behavioral resistance. So we, as leaders, want to be aware of this and we want to be looking out for this. So behavioral resistance can look like non-compliance, right? You haven't gone to the training. We've had the training available for 2 weeks and you haven't done it yet. Or reverting to old habits. I see that you're using the Excel spreadsheet, um, but we have the new system now. Why are you going back and using the old system? So that's really an example of behavioral resistance. And there's a lot of reasons why people could be doing that. I mean, it could be just their resistance to the change. It could be not having confidence in doing it the new way, feeling like they don't understand, and that fear of making mistakes or um, not looking competent can be a real sort of underlying current of what is happening when we see this kind of behavioral resistance. So, all of these things that I'm talking about, I want you to realize that these are things you can be looking for, and you want to be able to identify. If you have 5 people on your team, you could have one that is showing behavioral resistance, and another one that's showing cognitive resistance, and another one that's showing emotional resistance. But you want to be aware of that and be able to identify it because you can at least start with what you think is happening and have a plan to help them through it. The last type of resistance is structural. And this can be out of the control of the leader because it can be policies that contradict the change or reward old behavior. So it can be that the individuals themselves are constrained. They're not being resistant so much as the organization is set up in a way that is not adapting to the change. So, for instance, I think the best example could be, we've changed a process within our organization, within our area of the organization, but the other higher level parts of our organization haven't adapted their SOPs to that, to our new process, for instance. So what I want to end with is to kind of try to tie this all together a little bit and to tie the type of resistance to the potential ad card gap that could exist, as well as what the leaders should be focusing on. So again, if you have an employee that you see is expressing some type of emotional resistance to a change, then you want to maybe think about, is this a desire issue? Have I spent and invested enough time trying to convince this person, or more likely influence this person, to want to accept the change? And so the leader can focus on someone with emotional resistance on utilizing their empathy as to why they're emotionally reacting, acknowledging how they feel, utilizing communication, maybe, for instance, finding someone else on the team that has accepted the change and have that person act as sort of a change champion to work with them to help them through that emotional resistance. For cognitive resistance, the ad card gap can be awareness, just really understanding why is this happening and being aware of that. And so that leadership focus for someone who has cognitive resistance should be really providing very clear and consistent rationale for why the change is occurring. For behavioral resistance, we may have someone who is stuck in the ability gap of ADKAR, and that may be needing to give them more time to practice, more freedom to practice, giving them feedback on, how they're doing or what they could be doing. All of those are things that could be a leadership focus for people who are having behavioral resistance. And then finally, we have structural resistance, and that's much more challenging, right? Because we know that with structural resistance, we may not have the control of the organizational structure, but we ourselves need to be focused on the reinforcement. So, as much as we can, trying to work to get the system in alignment. That's what our leadership focus needs to be on, and also modeling that behavior of reinforcement. These are four classes that we have at graduate school that all have to do with change. And I want to mention something that I think I mentioned before everybody was in the room, which is a lot of our leadership classes touch on change. Even if the topic itself is not primarily change, a lot of our classes do touch on change because it is such an important topic for leaders. So we have the first class we have is Change Management for Leaders, Preparing for an Unknown Future. We have another class called Exploring Change at Work. We have a class called Understanding and Implementing Change in the Workplace. And finally, we have a class that is Leading Strategic Change. So I wanted to just end on that. And thank you to Amanda. She's putting the links into the chat so you can go straight to those classes if you want to learn more about it. But what I'd like to ask you guys to do now is, does anybody have any questions? You can just put them in the chat and I'll be happy to answer them. And also, if you click to download, you have the handout. Thank you, Amanda, for putting the handout in.
You're
I'm
welcome.
going to just stop and share really quick and show you that handout. So, what I tried to do on this handout was to just summarize what we talked about in the session today, but for each of them, give you a reflection so that you can sort of reflect on what we learned, reflect on, you know, how do you take what we talked about and hopefully be able to apply it to your real situation. All right, do we have any questions?
Nope.
Okay, I've got a question here. Does the leadership response change if the change is being championed at a higher level, mid-level manager versus top level? All right, so that's a great question. Yes, it certainly can. Um, Potentially change because obviously the higher level your change sponsor comes from, the more likely you are to have more sort of built-in support for a change versus if it's coming at maybe mid-level or lower. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. And it can make a big difference. It doesn't mean that change can't be successful from a lower level, but in theory, the higher the organization support is, the more ingrained support you're likely to have for a change. Any other questions? Can I get some more? We've got about, gosh, we have almost 10 minutes, 12 minutes. While I'm waiting for some more change questions, I do want to mention one thing that I think is very important for leaders to realize is that change is an excellent topic for team building. I'm also like, again, from my project management background, sort of love the concept and the topic of team building. What is really powerful for a leader, and I had a lot of people talk about having a new manager or a new leader come into an organization. But what's really great is if you can go in as a new leader and say, let's start talking about change now. What is your normal reaction to change? How much tolerance do you have for change? Let's talk about change before the change occurs. And when you create that environment of talking about change, it can be a great team building activity for a leader to have. And that kind of goes to Ernest. Thank you, Ernest, for the question. What are viable responses to a trust or loss issue when you're managing a change that came from above you? So that's a great question. That's why I think talking about change before the issue even comes up can create an environment of trust between you and your employees for changes before they even come. But obviously, it can be very challenging to respond to trust or loss issues when you're managing a change that you didn't have a say in. And I also want to say that leaders are human. You may also yourself hate the change, right? And that's one of the things that we talk about in our change classes is sort of how do you as a leader handle your own emotions to the change before you start helping somebody else through it. So viable responses are empathy, listening, trying to answer their questions as much as possible with the information that you know. Um, because it's very hard when you don't have control over that change and you may not love it as well. All right, I have another question. With return to office, have there been studies on the level of resistance to change among the various demographics, Gen X, Gen Z, boomers, etc.? That's a really interesting question. I have not seen any studies about that. I am going to tell you guys, truthfully, I am not a big believer in it's not that I don't believe in generational differences, but I hesitate to spend too much time on that because I feel like it's too easy to accidentally sort of stereotype someone. I also have an 84-year-old father who still works, who believes in his heart he's a millennial. Like he said, if I look at the generational differences, like the way they define the generations, I'm a millennial, even though he's 84 years old. And so, I sort of worry about focusing too much on the different demographics of generation. But having said that, I don't have any studies on that. Now, I will say that that of course, I do like looking at sort of different personality types. You could potentially say that there's some, like in a self-assessment, I can see how open people are to change, how potentially quick they are to accept a change. And so that is a personality difference that we see that can impact how people react to change. Oh, this is a good one. How to deal with leaders not on the same page and creating mixed messages across teams. That is such a challenging and such a real life thing that happens. It's such a challenge. So, you as a leader don't unfortunately have control over what other leaders are saying, especially the leaders above you, but trying to create consistency in messaging, at least with your team, as much as possible, is going to be critical, especially when you're not getting that from above. So that's a really great experience. So, do you have any recommendations or ideas for an activity on change? This is a team building activity workshop. Well, first of all, you could use the worksheet that Amanda was nice enough to put into the chat for us. Those reflection questions are reflection questions that you could use with your team. You also could have people sit down and reflect on a change they've experienced in the past. I really like to ask people, how did you feel when the change was announced? And how did you feel at the end? Because often people's first reaction is awful. And then once they go through the change, they realize, wow, I learned something. I really like the new system. And it can be a good reminder for people, but it's also great for you, not only for the team to kind of understand each other better and how they react to change, but as a leader, it can help you to understand what types of change reactions you might see from your team members in the future. And so that's why I like that as a team building activity. How do you help when one person is significantly more affected by the change than the rest of the team? What are some suggestions to help that person not feel so isolated in their change experience compared to the rest of the team? That is an excellent question. I love that. One of the reasons that I like leaders to talk about change before it even occurs is because you want to make it a team effort. And even if one person is more significantly impacted, reminding everybody we are a team and we are experiencing this together. So I talked about having a change champion that comes and gives particular support to one person, or having, during a team meeting, focusing on that change and talking about it as a group, even if it's really just impacting one person on the team. I think that's really important to feel like the person's not going through it alone. I find that sometimes we feel like we're experiencing it alone. We feel like we're the only ones that are maybe discombobulated by the change or frustrated or worried or whatever. And so when you create the environment for talking about it, it can really make a big difference. All right. Any other questions? Thank you for those good questions. Thank you for participating in our webinar today and in our poll questions. And thanks to Shige and Amanda and Claire for their great support technically as usual.
And also, just a really quick reminder, if you don't mind, Natalia, everybody who's on this webinar here, we do and will be sharing the recording. It's accessible on our website. So I'm going to share the link here just so you have it. The webinar recording will be available soon, actually today. So you'll see it up there once we get it posted, and you can reference it at any time. We also have previous webinars that are on there if you ever want to take a look. And then we have a whole series of webinars that's going that is scheduled currently right now in case you're interested in hopping on with us again. Thanks, Natalia. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining us today.